Hi, it's Tom with an analysis of the Star Wars Battlefront 2 beta. I was invited to DICE's Stockholm headquarters to check out 4 multiplayer modes running on PS4 Pro. That includes the arcade mode survival mission starring Darth Maul, an 8 vs 8 strike game on a beautiful new map called Takodana, plus a fresh look at the dogfighting in Starfighter Assault, where PS4 Pro's performance is improved since we last saw it. Lastly, there's the new signature 40-player Galactic Assault mode, pushing the console hardest, with large-scale battles while running in Pro's 4K mode, which is what you see here. This sets a precedent actually. DICE's Battlefront reboot launched in 2015, way before PS4 Pro's arrival, and as a result the game didn't get support for that console even retroactively. The best case was using Pro's boost mode to iron out some occasional frame rate dips, but by release the game generally ran at a smooth 60 FPS. It wasn't an issue, but resolution to this day is fixed at a native 900p for the original on-base PS4 with no visual upgrades. That's all changed for Battlefront 2. Ultra HD TV users get a similar dynamic resolution setup to Battlefield 1, and in this case, Battlefront now runs with 1440p as the peak target. In fact, 2560 by 1440 is the highest value I've caught in this beta. However, there's a catch, and taking the Starfighter Assault game as an example, that 1440p figure only really comes up within the very first 20 seconds of play, across an X-Wing as it flies into battle. After that, the native resolution scales down quickly to a different and more consistent figure, 2304 by 1296. There is some variance here, but 1296p is the most regular result across all 4 modes. Tellingly, even the relatively simple arcade mode, taking place purely on the Theed Palace interior, runs mostly at that number. For reference, that's a 60% scale on both axes from a full 4K, which in theory is the setting you'd use on PC to replicate PS4 Pro's resolution. As it goes, it's not the highest turnout on paper, but paired with the Frostbite engine's post-process anti-aliasing, the image still shines. The other good news is 1080p users now also benefit. Unlike the pre-alpha PS4 Pro build of Battlefront 2 we've already seen, that 1296p resolution is super sampled to a 1080p display. If we compare the 1080p and 4K modes side by side then, it's apparent there's no major difference either way. Some textures are in a different stage of loading in, but as far as level of detail, shadows and effects like motion blur go, it's the same on both sides. The only difference is, of course, the 4K output on PS4 Pro gives you a true 4K HUD, while a lower resolution one is used at 1080p. As far as this beta goes at least, there's not much in it, all of which means the rendering load is the same regardless of which mode is selected. Of course, Frostbite driven games so far have taken different routes for Pro support. There's no sign here of the checkerboarding seen in Mass Effect Andromeda or Battlefield 1 for example, and those games hit high resolutions as a result, like 1800p in Mass Effect's case. Battlefront 2 appears to play it straight by comparison, though it's worth bearing in mind the game is a very different technical beast to Battlefield anyway. CPU power isn't as much of a commodity here. The game has less physics-based destruction and a lower 40-player limit on even its biggest maps. It makes sense that Battlefront 2's resolution typically sticks to one value. Even if it doesn't hit the same peaks as Battlefield 1, I haven't seen any drastic lows either. At least until Xbox One X arrives, PS4 Pro shows us the highest resolution take on Battlefront 2 on console, and visually the Frostbite engine is rendering some stunning environments once again. The Takodana map in strike mode for example feels like it's plucked straight from The Force Awakens, and DICE's photogrammetry technique replicates the forest and castle materials with uncanny results. The original Battlefront already excelled with its authentic visuals and sound design. There was no shortcoming in this sense, and down to small details like rolling leaves and wildlife on the Naboo courtyard, Battlefront 2 carries on this excellent work. Paired with full screen and object-based motion blur, a fishbowl style lens filter and chromatic aberration, plus Star Wars' distinctive screen wipe transitions, this still feels like the truest video game representation of the films. It looks incredible. DICE doesn't go too far obviously, we're not talking about a 24 frames per second game here, and the engine proudly targets 60 FPS. There are some occasional drops once too many characters fill the screen at once. Note the droids at the start of this 40-player Naboo battle, and clearly there's our culprit for drops to near 50 FPS. But in the main, this beta is fixing to 60 FPS the majority of the time with VSync engaged too. Given Galactic Assault is the most intensive way to push the engine on PS4 Pro, that's not a bad turnout at all. The same largely applies to the 8 vs 8 strike mode games on Takodana, a newer and more densely detailed map based around a forest area. The good news continues with the Starfighter Assault mode. If you recall our pre-alpha analysis of this mode at Gamescom, the game suffered obvious dips on pro hardware. Mainly when entering hull areas inside larger ships, it hit lows of around 55 FPS, and that's running at 1080p with no apparent supersampling. Fast forward to this beta, and we have the game operating with 4K support, a high resolution, and flying through the same area sticks to 60 FPS regardless. It's a win-win on both frame rate and resolution, showing DICE's optimization work at play. There's a twist to the arcade mode too. The rendering setup has changed here, at least compared to what we saw in the original on a regular PS4. As you'd expect, playing arcade single player runs at 60 FPS, but surprisingly, switching to split screen play still keeps 60 FPS as the goal. Bearing in mind the base PS4 locked to 30 FPS in the original game when moving to split screen, that's an interesting development. Whether that's meant only for PS4 Pro given the extra GPU resource, or if that's how all console versions will run it remains to be seen. It'd be a challenge to hit this mark on less powerful hardware, especially given the drops to around 50 FPS we're seeing on PS4 Pro, but I'm hopeful we'll see it. Overall then, all this shows DICE has been very busy at work across the board with its multiplayer modes. It's a battle on several fronts, but PS4 Pro support is well and truly accounted for, and with improvements to frame rate since the pre-alpha build as well. A fuller perspective of what it brings to the table is only really possible once we have the final release on base PS4 to compare it with, something to look forward to near its November 17th launch. And of course there's the enticing prospect of Xbox One X support, and whether that gets much closer to a true 4K than Sony's machine. All will be revealed soon, but if you enjoyed this early beta coverage of Star Wars Battlefront 2 and want to see more, do let me know with a like or subscribe. And as ever, being a 4K video, it's well worth checking out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net to see the original source file. But until next time, thanks for watching.
Our battle cruisers arrived right on time. Take out those defenses and watch your cannons go to work. Our Y-Wings have initiated the bombing round. We need you to run interference.
Sealed. All units proceed inside and override the door control systems.
Grenade, arm!